Hello everybody, first Technical Tuesday of 2025, so Happy New Year. Hope everyone had a good Christmas break. To start off the new year, I wanted to talk a little bit about Alphabet shares. So we're doing actually quite a lot in the next couple of months on this topic. We've got next week, Michael Sherry's coming in to do a podcast with us on the tax hour. We'll be releasing that on the 16th of January. So there'll be a lot of technical talk in there, which will be really interesting. And the main reason I thought this would be a good topic for this week is we've got a MBL webinar in February, which I'll put a link to in the description. I had a huge take up on that, by far the biggest take up I've ever had on an MBL webinar in the hundreds. So we've added a couple of extra sessions. I think it's on the 5th of February. We've got one in the morning. We've just added the afternoon as well. And then we've got a further one in March. And then we're planning a more technical, in-depth advanced course as well. So clearly, this is a huge topic. There's a lot of different issues when we're considering Alphabet shares, both whether it's to an employee or to other individuals, say in family investment company scenarios. What is an Alphabet share? Basically, we can call it a share class whatever we like. Basic companies will just be set up with a single class of shares. Often you'll see £101 ordinary shares in a company, for example. Alphabet shares just means that we can have different classes of shares with different share rights. We can distinguish different rights, whether they're voting, capital or dividends, or a mixture of them, so that certain individuals have different rights to others. That might be done, a very common one is so that directors can pay dividends at their discretion on different classes of shares under company law. There is some slight issue there under the Companies Act. We do need to be careful with section 629, which basically says that a share is of the same class if its rights are in all respect uniform. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but basically if you have exactly the same share rights, just because you've called them A and B doesn't necessarily mean for company law purposes they are different classes. So be careful of that. As I say, you might see these in family planning type situations if you want to issue growth shares. So especially with property companies, we can't necessarily just gift shares to future generations because there's capital gains tax exposure. So we might issue growth shares. Normally that encompasses freezing the existing shares and issuing the next generation with a share class that only entitles them to future growth in value. And by doing that, we are not exposing ourselves to CGT on the gift of those growth shares to them. When we're looking at employment related securities, which is what we'll be going in depth with Michael Sherry next week, we are concerned about income tax charges for the employee and also PAYE and national insurance if they're readily convertible assets. So when we're talking about issuing shares to employees, again, some companies want to issue just dividend only shares so that they can pay dividends to employees. For me, that's a very, very contentious area. I think if you are just issuing dividend only shares to employees, either you're doing that because you want to pay a bonus, which should be remuneration anyway, so that planning would technically fail, or you're planning on doing some sort of potentially salary sacrifice. So instead of paying someone, say, $60,000 a year, you're going to pay them $20,000 a year and $40,000 as dividends. Again, that's not going to work because that's nothing more than disguised remuneration. So we need to be very careful when we're talking dividend only shares that it's actually going to be taxable as a dividend if HMRC were to look into it. But when we're talking about Alphabet shares, it's very common that you would issue a separate class of shares from founder shares, for instance, to employees because maybe you don't want them to have voting rights, just capital or dividends, or maybe you want to restrict their dividend, capital or voting rights. So you can, within the realms of the articles, you can decide what rights each class of share has. So there's a huge amount to go through, which is exactly why we've got an MBL webinar coming up. That's obviously going to cover all things about Alphabet shares, so the family planning scenarios and the employment scenarios. Next week, we'll be talking to Michael Sherry on the employment-related securities issues. As I say, I I've got hours worth of material we need to go through on this, but hopefully that's just a little teaser as to what we need to be considering. As always, like, comment, share. It lets me know that these videos are well received, and if you have any comments or interpretation of this legislation, really interested to hear everyone's thoughts.